أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم من همزه ونفخه ونفثه بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Just wanted to give you an introduction really quick. So today, inshallah, we're going to do a little bit of review from what we talked about last time. But before we do that, let's go into the weekly check-ins or the daily check-ins. So how has your week been? What are your goals for this weekend and this upcoming week? How are you preparing to meet them while balancing between commitments? Pretty much, how's everything going? What do you have in mind? Anything that you have in terms of tips and pointers? Anything that you have in terms of struggles that you are looking for tips on? Just anything. So we've been talking about the point A, point B. We were talking about making sure things are realistic. There's a difference between something that is achievable and something that is realistic, right? Something that is achievable could be, for example, you want to get $1 million. That's definitely something that people can do, right? But what it might not be is realistic. By the way, I'm pulling this from the SMART goals. SMART is an acronym, right? So S, for example, indicates a specific, something very specific, right? The A is what I'm talking about over here. The A is something, M is measurable, A is achievable, and R is realistic, right? And then T is time-based. It's like time-bounded, essentially, right? So the idea is that something that's achievable, like $1 million, may not be realistic in a given time frame that you have, for example. So you might say, I want to be a millionaire tonight. And that's not necessarily realistic, right? But if you say, for example, over the next 30 years, I want to be a millionaire, and you can be, right? If you just earn, for example, a certain amount of money, you have you're frugal, like Warren Buffett was. So like, for example, in his case, he used to save every penny as much as possible and stuff. He was very, very he didn't spend much money and stuff. He was just trying to accumulate all this wealth over the course of time. So now he has all this money, right? Because he sort of didn't spend it. He was very frugal, very he didn't spend much money. So that was his way of becoming a millionaire over the course of time. So that was very realistic that you could do that, but it was also achievable. So something that's achievable doesn't necessarily mean it's realistic. So keep those things in mind, right? So that's what we were trying to do, making sure that things are realistic, that they can actually happen, right? Or they can happen in the time frame that you want. But they're also, another thing that we were talking about, another dimension, is they're actually achievable. Like, these are things that are real, things that can happen in real life. So both of those fit under the category of what I was explaining as something that has to be actually possible. Okay, so we were just giving examples of when things go wrong. Last time I had to stop the recording when we were doing an actual discussion between the attendees, right, of this particular topic as a case study for them to sort of explore. I want to sort of just give you a summary of what that is. We talked a little bit about what is sustainable, what's not sustainable in this context, about globalization, about exploitation. We talked about fair trade as a solution. For example, fair trade, you get the same amount of money wherever you are, in the sense of the service that you're providing, right? So for example, a farmer who is taking some cocoa seeds, and that his efforts over there are going to be compensated with a fair estimate of his effort in the grand scheme of things, right? So you're not going to try to buy something from him at a rate that might sort of be okay in his country, right? But because his country is one of the developing countries, and because for example, the income over there may be very little, right? And so on. So you might just try to say, let me take advantage of this and stuff because I'm in a developed country. For example, I'm in the United States, but I want to exploit the people over there and stuff, in the sense of buying very cheap, or getting very cheap labor and stuff like that. And we talked about how some of the big clothing companies, for example, do this. You'll find Polo, for example, or other brands, you'll see that their tags say that they're made in Vietnam, for example, or they're made in Pakistan or Bangladesh and stuff, right? Because the labor over there is very cheap. But it doesn't mean that it's fair for the people, because and we also talked about um, IT support, for example, that's outsourced to India, for example, and so on, right? And so they're providing the same service as a person over here, but they're just giving them different amounts of money, right? But the service is the same, the effort is the same. This is similar to, for example, women, for example, in the workforce. If they're working and doing the same exact thing as men, right, and there's no difference in that, then they should be compensated according to the going rate, not because of their gender, right? And so that the same thing is like, if you're talking about a global economy, then in that case, you should be fair in terms of providing everyone the actual worth of their labor in the global market, not just in a local market and stuff like that. Because people will exploit each other like that. Then because like in this case, they might outsource the stuff and prevent the people in their own countries from getting the same opportunities and stuff like that. Now, another thing was the standard of living. We discussed that a little bit, and the idea of standard of living. In the context of standard of living, one of the things that we were talking about is that for example, for example in Pakistan, the income that you might be getting is a lot less than what you need to survive. Like for the average person, the income is not as much as the cost of living over there. So it's important to understand, sometimes the salaries, for example, are not up to par with the standard of living. And then even if the going standard is for like a minimum wage or whatever, or like the going salaries for different tasks, maybe certain things, maybe a certain amount, but it may not be actually suitable for that actual living condition. So for example, a lot of people are not able to make ends meet, essentially, because of this. They're working instead of the kinds of jobs that they were doing beforehand, that were able to maintain their families and so on, are now being very difficult to continue working in and still be able to provide for their families, right? So there's the expenses are increasing, but the income is sort of like stabilized at the same level, sort of, right? And it's not increasing as much as the inflation of prices and stuff like that. So there's a lot of dynamics that go in there. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obviously has a system that He has put down through Islam. And if you look at, we talked about, if you look at Sahih Bukhari, Imam al-Bukhari has a chapter in it, Kitab al-Buyu, and in this he talks about the different rules that Muslims have, right? That we need to. He mentions a bunch of hadith wherein he talks about different, or where he's trying to indicate certain rules that Muslims need to follow in transaction. For example, there's no like deception, right? There's no deception allowed in trading in Islam. There's no uncertainty in contracts that it's allowed, right? For example, if you tell me that I'm going to sell you a bunch of, for example, shoes, right? In the context, in the hadith, you might see it as fruits, but in our society, for example, it may be fruits, or it might be something else. It might be, for example, raw material. It might be shoes or whatever, right? But you haven't actually seen that stuff, right? Or you don't know what it's going to be like, and there's no quality assurance that's necessarily guaranteed for you and stuff, right? So what happens is you might get deceived, or you might get tricked, right? Because there's ambiguity. Are we talking about the shoes that are sold in the market like regular, or are they the ones that are B class or C class or whatever, meaning they're like the seconds or whatever, right? Seconds means like they have some sort of error, or like something wrong with them. It might be very little, but it is something that made them not be able to go with the regular line of shipment, right? Or to go to the regular end users and stuff, right? Or in the markets and stuff like that. So you might sell that person, you might sell you might be sold those items without realizing it. So the person might say, I'm selling you shoes, and these are like brand shoes or whatever, and that's it. They might not give you the defects in them, and then in that case you're going to be at a loss. So Islam does not allow these kind of uncertainties. You have to know the details of what you're buying and what you're selling. And if any person sort of hides that, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us not to do that. The Prophet told us not to do that. Make sure that you don't conceal any faults. Make sure you're very clear about things and so on. And that's how that works. If you notice also in the context of Bitcoin, when it first came out, this is where the conversation was going in, right? Because it's a new currency, it's not sort of guaranteed by something else, for example, and things like that. So there's a lot of questions about it. Now again, some people said it's allowed, some people said it's not allowed, because so they were analyzing it with these I guess you could say maxims, these sort of like legal maxims in Islamic finances and stuff, right? And so they were saying, okay, well, from this aspect, it might be a danger to the buyer, it might be a danger to a seller, it might be like, all these things were being mentioned, discussed, and you'll see that a lot in the context of, for example, insurance, for example, credit cards. You'll see that also in the context of buying homes, for example, like Islamic financing versus the other kind of model, right? You'll see this in the context of investments, for example. You'll see that in the context of so many different places. So it's very important for us to understand that. But Islam gives us those solutions to what would otherwise be experiments in the markets. People are going to try to figure out how to how to navigate things. Some people are going to be greedy. They're going to try to exploit other people and so on. They're going to harm other people and so on. So there's going to be experiments. So that people are going to come up with rules and regulations to, as you know, for example, in investments, insider trading, for example, is illegal. So in that case, you can get in trouble if you did that and so on. So what that does, insider trading meaning if you have inside information and then you sort of sell stocks or buy stocks based on that inside information to sort of get ahead of the markets and stuff, and and get an unfair advantage from the rest of the people and stuff, then those things are not allowed, right? So these are things that happened, and as a result, they put rules and regulations in place to avoid that from happening in the future, right? So they're learning as they go, right? Whereas in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala already gives us heads up here. This is like human nature. This is what's likely going to happen. This is why you need to put these systems in place. This is why these rules need to be in place. This is what you need to do. All that stuff is sort of explained. And if you go into the books of hadith, if you go to the books of fiqh and stuff like that, this is among the most discussed topics, because it deals with how people their money and all that stuff is, how that works and stuff. So we mentioned in Maqasid al-Sharia, in the lowest level, the essentials, right? We mentioned that one of them is protection of wealth. So from the hadith like these, for example, and stuff in the Quran, for example, وَلَا تَأْكُلُوا أَمْوَالَكُمْ بَيْنَكُمْ بِالْبَاطِلِ, don't eat your each other's wealth unjustly, right? Um, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this in the Quran as a way of deterring people from exploiting each other in terms of their hard-earned income or wealth or whatever property that they might have and so on. So there's a lot of these protections in place. So this is where they sort of, after going through all these hadith and discussions and things like that, they started saying, okay, what is the end objective of these rulings, for example, right? So throughout the centuries, as they were discussing more and more content, they were discussing the benefits of society and so on. And then one of the things they mentioned is that the scholars, they said one of the maqasid of Sharia, for example, is the protection of wealth. Okay, hifdhul mal. So you want to make sure that's one of the that's implemented in whatever system that you put down, or whatever whatever you do in your regular affairs, in your personal affairs, in your group affairs, or whatever it might be, that you protect people's wealth, right? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has this as one of the objectives of the Sharia. And if that objective is not being achieved, then there's a problem there, and that needs to be rectified, right? So I just understand that this is what Muslims are. Muslims are, making sure that society is working in optimal condition, and then that's what it is, right? It's not just prayer and stuff. But definitely, prayer is the thing that is the first and most important thing, right? And you got to make sure you do that. But at the same time, it has follow-up actions, right? And then follow-up actions beyond prayers and stuff, right? Is that you're required to help in maintaining the functioning of an optimal society, essentially. So that's that, right? Okay, so let me just go over really quickly of some of the things that I kind of breezed over last time. We talked about truths, and we said this is reality, this is fact, and it could be something that is known, for example, somebody is living and somebody is not living, that's live, somebody that's alive or somebody that's dead. It could be something, for example, that we've designated as, with words. For example, we have some sounds for the word sun, and we point at the sun in the sky, right? And we say this, and then we make a sound, and we have, we pair them together, right? This is how, computers work, for example. This is how they were designed. You sort of designate a sound, in this case, right, to a meaning, or an object or a concept, right? And then anytime you make that sound in the people's ears, right, or when they hear this sound, it triggers that concept, because that's where it's connected to. They mentally, right, their brain sort of took that, the word sun, right, the sound that it might have made, and connected it to the object in the sky, right? So that's how the pairing works. So this is also something that we can say as fact, in the sense that this is what's been designated, right? And as long as we're all on the same page, we're good to go. So, this is what we were doing when we say sun, or when we teach our kids something, for example, the word red, right? We are helping them sort of like get on the same page as the rest of society. And then in different, languages, they're still referring to the same concept, but they have different sounds associated that might be easier for their people to understand. But when people who speak two languages, when they see that there's the same concept, that the same word, or sorry, the same object or whatever has multiple sounds that are associated with it, right? Meaning two different languages have two different sounds, right? For example, red in English is red, right? But then in Urdu it might be lal. So in these, like, there's two different sounds but had the same concept that they were attached to, right? So understanding these are facts as well. So keep that, and then I gave some examples over here. Now also when it comes to hypotheses and theory and model and skeptic, we talked about this a little bit, and I wanted to differentiate these words from truth, because they're sort of disconnected, right? I wanted to show that there's one on the one hand and then the others on the other hand. There's certainty on one hand, and then like sort of doubts and suspicion and uncertainty on the other hand. So hypothesis was sort of just an explanation for something of why something might be working, or like the process of how something worked out or whatever and stuff, right? But it has to be something that you can test. And when you test it, and eventually, it seems to be it seems to be true. You test again. You try in a different context, and it seems to be how true as well. You try it a different thing or whatever, and it still works. You try a different way and stuff, and it still works. So as long as it's working and stuff, then what we can call that is a theory. So this is a theory that has more and more weight added onto it based on repeated experimenting, right? And then a model is sort of like a framework. We talked about schemas in the context of learning. So just keep that in mind also, that this is how this is working. And then skeptic, and we mentioned that every scientist should be a skeptic, in the sense that they should be sort of adapting to whatever they're finding out as truths, right? Or whatever they're, not necessarily truths, but whatever they're finding out through their experimentation and so on, right? So it's like a person who's unsure about something, right? In the context of science, right? Because scientists are not never actually like certain about certain things, right? Or many of the things that they're doing, they're not actually certain about it, unless, for example, they're denying like something, whatever, in certain contexts, or they're affirming something, for example. But it's very specific, and again goes back to what we talked about over here, like setting certain truths and stuff like that, like designating, for example, this is red, this is like a hydrogen atom, for example, versus like a lithium ion, for example, right? So that being able to differentiate that, so the designations in that case could be true. So that's what I mean over here, the certainty. Okay, so what that means, it connects back to what we talked about in terms of discipline. Like as you're continuing towards your goal, you're going to keep optimizing your approach, like based on whatever understandings that you have, new understandings, new learning that you have, and so on, right? So as you find out new truths, for example, you're going to account for them in your process by evaluating what you're doing towards your goal. Hey, I found out that this is not going to work out, or this doesn't work out normally and stuff, right? So let me not have this as part of my process towards my end vision, right? So you can constantly adjust that. And I also mentioned that here, genetics versus epigenetic factors. What that means is genetics are things that it's like, let's in this context simplify it. Let's assume that this is your DNA, for example, right? And that's how you're born. Now, epigenetic factors are things that that you're influenced, and this is related to your genes, for example. And let's say you are in a certain environment, or you got exposed to certain like chemicals, or you got exposed to whatever it might be, right? So in those contexts, you might be happy about something, whatever, and stuff, right? You might be in a certain environment, you might be like learning certain things and stuff. So all of these things coming together can impact certain things in your body, right? So this is like, a lot of this could be environmental, right? This could be like nature instead of nurture, for example. Actually, sorry, it could be nurture instead of nature. Sorry, let me say that again. It could be nurture, meaning like it has impact from your outside and stuff, like how you grow up, for example, what you do, what you learn and stuff like that, right? What your experiences have been and so on. It could be a lot of that, right, as opposed to like what you're born with, essentially. Okay, so being able to differentiate between these helps us understand how to navigate forward. So for example, scientists are telling you, for example, that homosexuality is not necessarily genetics. It's more epigenetic. Okay. And there was a study that I mentioned. It had about 500,000 people's DNA evaluated and so on. And that's a side note, but I was just giving examples. So sometimes people confuse the two, and they assume one thing over another. So understanding like the difference between um, different designations, for example, or different words, for example, is very important in how to move forward, how to understand reality. Sometimes we don't do that and we get confused. Okay, so this is that was the review, and also the people that might not have gotten, like if I had didn't mention some of those things in the recording, then you have that now, inshallah. Okay, so now some of the things that I'd like for you guys to explore on this topic are Islamophobia and dawah. For example, in the context of like how people learn and their theories that develop as a result of what they learn, right? Not necessarily the truth, the capital T truth, but these are their lowercase t truths, right? Because of their learning processes and so on, right? So that Islamophobia that people end up having as a result, right? And the context that it comes in dawah, for example, like if a person is giving dawah, they want to make sure that they understand where the origin of this person's Islamophobia is coming from, right? And how that therefore they can address that narrative. So how they can say, for example, okay, this person seems to have gotten these ideas from this sort of like learning, this experiences that they had, or whatever they watched here, or whatever they read here, and stuff like that. So you sort of assess where that is, and then when you sort of understand where this person is coming from, then you can address those things from the root, because you say, okay, well, this person may have had a bad experience. Okay, does that necessarily mean that this person does that necessarily mean that Muslims are bad, for example, right? Does that necessarily mean that his judgment of Islam is correct or not, right? And then you can sort of like bring him back to the capital T truths by actually going back to what the actual stuff is, right? So you want to understand how to navigate context with people, by understanding where their learning came from, where their mindset is from, and so on. So with that, other examples are racism, for example. What is your origin? We explored a little bit in the context of slavery, and one of the things was that one of the ways to justify Africans as slaves, right, as opposed to any other race, any other color, for example, like just to justify that people from a very specific area of the world, and you're taking them as captives to make them to justify that, right? To justify why is it just these people as opposed to Europeans, as opposed to like Desis, for example, as opposed to Chinese, as opposed to whoever else in the world, right? Why was it just that group of people? To justify that, this is where the concept of racism came in, right? And we talked about scientific racism was also something that was prevalent, where people tried to justify that in fact there might be this race might be inferior because of like brain like size or whatever and things like that. So they try to justify it like that. So they had this premise in their mind, like a theory, a hypothesis, to be able to justify the trade of slaves. So they wanted to come up with a justification for why only this particular group of people instead of others. So this is that. So understanding this helps you sort of like unpack things and then address them accordingly, right? As opposed to sort of reacting to them and just kind of like going all over the place. You're very systematic, very organized, and you're able to therefore cut to the root, cut to the chase, essentially, instead of like not knowing how to navigate those contexts, right? And not getting overwhelmed and not getting frustrated and annoyed and why is this happening? Why is this happening? If you understand where Islamophobia originates from, and then you can address it directly. You can unpack the things and say, okay, this person is not an evil person coming at me trying to say like Islam is bad, but this person may really actually be afraid of Islam because of what they have in terms of their experiences, right? And is that right? Are they right in doing that, or should they have gone through different steps that actually read the Quran, for example, and the Hadith of the Prophet and so on? Which what is the right way to do it? You can actually teach them that then, but you need to. It helps you knowing where this is coming from to help you not react in the moment in a negative way, right? To kind of navigate it in a more optimistic way, but also to put appropriate solutions in place as opposed to inappropriate ones that don't match the actual cause of situation. Other things, for example, would be other things that you should explore, or you can explore, um, are life crises. Like, why do people have life crises, right? Where is that coming from? Maybe they had certain expectations of how their life should be, right? But they didn't match with the reality, right? So maybe that's where it's coming from. Maybe they didn't know how they had certain expectations that did match with reality, right? But they didn't know how to get there. Or maybe the approach they were using was not optimal, or maybe their context was not really supporting it, right? So there's a lot of things that you can unpack by understanding the idea of truth, right? Facts, reality versus like theories and like things that people sort of do in terms of experiments and stuff like that. Human beings sort of like we learn information, we take it, we sort of start coming up with lines of best fit that we talked about before, and then we sort of interpret different new contexts or whatever accordingly, right? And so and that's where like we talked about biases and sort of coming. So same thing with life crises. A lot of times we run off of that. We don't actually learn the truth. Allah Subhanahu wa Taala gives us the truth directly, right, from the Quran and so on, right? So we get the truth from there, but not everyone actually learns it. We spend so much time learning and like trying to figure out the truth in a different way by going through like in a long way around, instead of just going directly to the root of it. Allah Subhanahu wa Taala give us the stuff. Let's go directly to it, and we cut to the chase. We know how to, for example, in business, instead of having to do test and trial and error, right? Instead of doing like a large social experiment in politics, for example, in the business world, for example, if we had put certain practices in place already in the very beginning, we wouldn't have had those kinds of exploitations or like kind of situations where people sort of like took people's money and stuff like that. You know how like these pyramid schemes and stuff, all that work, right? So those kinds of things would not have happened essentially, or if they had happened, it wouldn't have been as large scale, or or there might have been like proper consequences for those people and stuff like that, where these kinds of things would have become the punishment would have been a deterrent for other people and stuff like that to not do the same thing. So these things are important to keep in mind. So I just mentioned some of the things over here. New Muslims and first steps, meaning sometimes Muslims start off, they become Muslim, and they sort of try to swallow everything all at once, right? And they don't understand that they might get overwhelmed by that. They think that they need to like and this is from their perspective, that they're trying to be as sincere as possible. They're like, we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can, and they have this energy and stuff like that, so that from their perspective, they're doing something good. And but what happens is like when they get overwhelmed, then they sort of like not able to continue onwards. So one of the things that that we advise new Muslims is to take it step by step. Don't just jump all at once, because Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala does not expect for you to have everything mastered at one time, right? Because even the Muslims that are Muslims for all their lives and stuff, right? They haven't mastered everything all at once either, right? They actually even haven't mastered it, right? They haven't even mastered it even now, like after like let's say 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years of Islam, being Muslim, they haven't mastered those things. So it's Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala does not expect people to just like press a button and they're like perfect in the next day in terms of like knowing how to do everything. Likewise, for the origin of Islamic sects, a lot of times, like many of the original sects, like in the areas of Iraq and so on, right? You might also have some in like Yemen, for example, and so on. In the early history of Islam, right? What started happening is that people who were becoming Muslim from the other boundaries of like at the outside areas, because the boundaries were expanding. So it went from Medina onwards and stuff. So let's say now it gets to Iraq and so on, and the people in the Byzantine Empire, the Roman, the Persian Empire and so on, right? They're becoming Muslim, but they also had their own perceptions of what gods are. They had this idea of anthropomorphism, for example, like their gods looked like human beings, for example, or they were human beings and so on, right? They had this idea that there could be like a deity in the flesh, for example, and so on. So a lot of these concepts started coming into them, right? And they brought that in. Instead of saying, okay, we're going to submit completely and we're going to reframe ourselves, align it to what Islam says, they tried to interpret Islam and whatever they were learning from from their baggage that they were bringing in from the previous belief systems that they had, right? Not everyone did that, obviously, but they were, a lot of these sects started forming around this concept. They sort of brought whatever baggage that they had, and they tried to impose that, project it onto what Islam would have been. So, like instead of accepting Islam, they sort of like tried to change Islam to accommodate their worldview of things. So this is some things to keep in mind there too. Likewise for parenting, like sometimes we come in thinking that just parenting is like we don't actually have people mostly like take courses in parenting before they become parents. They just become parents and they just sort of default to whatever they think parenting is, right? And so is that really how parenting is supposed to be, or is it something different, right? Islam actually gives us guidelines on how to be parents. Islam gives us guidelines how to be with other people in the context of peer pressure, for example, and so on. Likewise, you can see like for empires, nations, and governments, and so on. One of the things my AP World History teacher used to say, for example, is the default assumption could be, if in the context of how an empire fell down, you can say that one of the most likely possibilities was that it overextended, right, and it became too large for it to be able to actually sustain itself, and so on, right. So those were some things to keep in mind, that sometimes their expectations sort of went beyond what was reality, right, or what their assumptions were not actually aligned with it, right? how reality works. Sometimes when they were subjugating people, they were oppressing people and stuff, they were thinking that they're going to be able to get away with it, but in fact, people's resilience and people's like fighting back and stuff actually proved otherwise. So this is where some things went wrong too. Multi-level politics, I also wanted to say that in the sense of like, there's like the city level politics, there's like the state level politics, there's, even district level politics, for example. There's also like, if you go higher than that, you have like, the country level politics and so on, right? And all of them, they have this thing where, we think, for example, that the politicians are driving the world essentially, but in reality, it's the masses, in terms of push, whatever, who has like, like money, for example, whoever has more power, not power, like influence, by like coming in with lots of money or lots of resources and stuff, right? Lots of connections, right? That person has some sort of influence on politics. So that's where lobbyists come in and so on. And then you can see how that impacts a lot of things, is that where things that need to be done, in terms of from justice, social justice or whatever other justice standpoint, they don't actually come to pass because of that. So how do we address that? How do we unpack that and then like put up solutions according to that? Where is this coming from? And where is the system going wrong, right? Are lobbyists a good thing, for example, right? Are they a bad thing, or how do we maintain what's good and bad? Those systems in politics, right? Who gets to decide what's right and wrong? If it's the masses, then today they have certain things in mind what's right, but then tomorrow they might have the exact opposite of what's right. So who is actually right? Because in the future of those people, the third group of people later on, even, right, they might have something completely different. So now you have three different possibilities of what truth could be, right? And so all these things can become really complicated and stuff, and this is the idea of experiment. This is like a big giant social experiment of, here, let's try a hypothesis, this might work and stuff, let's try it, right? But you're experimenting with people, with human beings, and like lives and stuff, right? And so that idea is not really like if you consider it, it's not really the optimal way to go, because if you have another solution that is sort of cut and dry, pretty much like, okay, you can do this, you don't have to experiment with people's lives and like property and wealth and all that stuff, right? Then that should be the easy way, the better way to do it. But then people don't, they don't accept that, and so they want to try their own things, and so they test these things on human guinea pigs essentially, right? And so that's where we have cases where people lose all this money because of being scammed, for example. We have all these systems where like injustice continues to propagate, like racism, for example, in America, because it was at the highest level, right? And at the end of the day, because there's no standard of what actually defines what's good and bad, it's sort of whatever the sentiment is, or whoever's in power gets to sort of like gauge the interest of the people and say, okay, well, the people they seem to be pushing towards this, like the majority is white people, so they were thinking that Africans are like lower intellect or lower whatever, so therefore we're going to go by that because that's the majority of people thinking that way. So the idea of utilitarianism, whatever the majority thinks or whatever, we'll go with that even if it oppresses people and stuff that are minorities, right? So Islam actually proposes a different solution. It says, no, actually you need to actually be able to justify the difference between people before you can before you separate them and stuff, or give different rulings to different people and so on. So race is not one of those justifications, for example. Context is, but like not necessarily race. Okay, so and then investments, for example, people jump into invest into things and stuff, but they actually end up in the beginning they have certain expectations. The idea of FOMO, when like they see that there's a particular stock, or like in the case of Bitcoin, for example, in the case of the dot-com bubble, for example, right? The idea was like, these companies are going to go up really well and stuff. There's like this boom or whatever. So everyone, like, even grandparents, for example, and everyone is like putting all this money and stuff, right? And then it starts going up to a certain point, and then the bubble bursts essentially, right? Or people sort of, they buy in when they see that the stock has reached a certain high, whatever, because like the stock was growing really, really fast, and then it sort of gets to a really high point, and then they invest there, right? But then the markets have to correct themselves, sort of consolidate and stuff like that, so that the price is going to go down a little bit, right? People are going to sell off a little bit like that. So you go in at the very end where you thought the price is really high, and you're thinking the momentum is going to continue, but then actually like markets correct themselves, sort of they get back to consolidate, they consolidate, and then like the prices go down a little bit, and then you like, I lost all this money, and then you start losing hope in the market. So if you have the right mindset that you should not like have this FOMO mindset, then that makes it a little bit easier for you to be a better investor, for example. And the same thing with careers and life happiness. What is something that's going to make me happy? Sometimes people think just getting money is the end goal, and so they get all these jobs and stuff like that they're really not happy with, but they get a lot of money out of it, but they're really not happy with their life, right? And so they go disgruntled in the morning and stuff or whatever, right? Or however they're working, and then at the end of the day they're not actually happy. So they come home, their environment, like their attitude might be very toxic to their family members and so on. They might be very toxic to their friends. It might be like very toxic to their community and stuff, right? And so at the end of the day, they didn't actually get what they were thinking that they're going to get when they were young or whatever, or what their parents were sort of like, advising them to do. They did it. The parents were thinking that it's all about money, for example, and that you get a big house, you're going to be happy, right? But that's not how life works, right? And the same thing happens with parenting, because, this person might become a parent and think that, well, they need to continue the cycle. But essentially, these kinds of things can really impact people. So it's important to understand, there is a balance between, things that you like and the career that you get into. You shouldn't just get into a career that just because it's high paying, but you absolutely hate it, because it's going to impact your personality and your interaction with people, relations with people and stuff, right? And then there's like, just the overall mental health and so on. And then on the other hand, not everything that that you enjoy is actually going to be able to help you pay your bills, for example, right? So there's a balance between that, but you got to make sure that you're not like living in la la land or whatever, that just because I'm going to get money and stuff, I'm going to be good to go. Some people, they might spend like 50 years of their life just working, and then now they're so old when they want to retire that now they have all this money, but they're not able to actually spend it with the people that were meaningful to them, like their kids, for example, who were growing up, they got married, they moved on and stuff like that. But now this person has time, but the kids don't have any more time, right? So, and like the person himself or herself has all this money, but they don't have the energy or like, the mobility, for example, to be able to actually enjoy that money and stuff. So if you look at surveys from older people, they'll advise like to make sure you capture the moments, before you missed out on them like later on in life. So have priorities in life, and so Allah also tells us about priorities in life to keep those in mind. That family, for example, is a priority. That everyone has rights on you and stuff, and you have rights on others and stuff. Right? There's certain rights that you have, that your body has rights on you, and so on. So these things need to be accounted for, and this is a more balanced system of life that Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala proposes to us if we choose to accept it. Okay, I think this is the last slide. Just really quick, on this topic. Now we've finished. After for you guys to go ahead and explore some of those things, inshallah. You can also look into wars, for example. Why do wars happen? Like, how to avoid them and so on. There's a lot of more topics that you can unpack, but I just wanted to give you some various topics to explore, to go from. Okay, so just really quick on this. This is the next topic, inshallah. I'm gonna just give you an introduction and just close off after that, inshallah. This is we talked about point B, the end vision, right? When we were talking about that here, right? But now we're going to step 2. So this is current status and inventory. This is what we're going to be covering. So I just want to give you a heads up, before we start that next time, inshallah. But the idea is, what is the current situation? What is it going on right now? Where am I right now? Right? Be very realistic on where you are right now. It's very important for us to then. Let me go back to this slide, and you can see what I have points here. You should be very honest and raw, as in like you shouldn't like try to pretend like certain things are not the way they are. Be very clear about them, right? Be sure about your skills and weaknesses and stuff. This is very important here, because if you don't know where your skills and weaknesses are, you don't have a way to sort of measure them relative to where you want to be, or wherever you were in the past, for example, right? If you don't know how to measure them, if you don't know how to evaluate them and stuff, then you should get that taken care of. There are skills inventory, like strength inventory, for example. There's a lot of these kinds of things that you could do to help you out. That you just have to go and say a skills inventory template, for example, or like a survey, for example, or whatever. There's a lot of things you can find out there. But my idea right now is just to present you the concept, and you have to be very objective. You can't be like subjective in the sense that like you can be subjective in a certain context, but like what I mean over here is be like truthful. Don't try to twist things around and stuff like that, right? Okay, so that's the the process flow over here. You should do research and consultation, for example. Try to figure out what's going on. What's the sentiment right now? How things are right now. You can if you're, for example, if you want to get into a particular career, for example, or you want to buy a certain thing, whatever, or if you want to like go to work at a certain company, for example, or if you want to like run a masjid, for example, or if you want to whether masjid or another organization, whatever, right? You need to understand how things are, what's going on, get a feel for it. So I know one imam, for example, he was he came to be like, a principal of a particular school somewhere. And this is like it's a Hifz school. So he came over there as like, Hifz principal and so on. He was going to like oversee some of the things and stuff. So one of the first things that he wanted to do is to just evaluate how things are. What's the relationship between the teachers and the current staff members, for example? How are they interacting with each other? What's going on? How's the system working and stuff? It's kind of like evaluate before he actually said anything, like before he actually instituted any rules or whatever. He wanted to just kind of gauge what's going on, right? And so that's something that you could do. For example, what are things happening right now, right? If you know where you want to get to, and then you also know where you're starting off from, right? Then it'll be easy for you to actually make real moves from point A to point B. But if you're not really honest about point A, you're pretending like you're actually like halfway already to point B, but you're actually not. Then you're gonna have problems and stuff. Your expectations are gonna be thrown off and stuff like that. So just make sure that like we need to make sure that we have all these things in here. You want to make sure that you analyze your research and whoever you consult to just kind of like get their feedback instead of analyze it, assess it. Okay, is this feasible for me? Is this something that I want to do? Is it not? What are the needs in the context? What are my strengths? What are the strengths of the people that I'm working with? For example, their weaknesses are my weaknesses. Any obstacles, any barriers to entry, for example, whatever it might be, and so on. And then in the context of fiqh, for example, there's this rule that the hukum is based on the surah, or the complete understanding. Sort of, you have to understand the entire picture, right? So the whatever the judgment is on a matter, it depends on the complete understanding of the matter. So the fuqaha are not like, they don't give fatwas until they sit down and evaluate all the details. Like, for example, even in the context of printed money, right? The fuqaha actually went back all the way, traced it back to the origin of idea of currency, like coins and stuff like that. And then they said, okay, where does the idea of like a note, like an actual printed money note, come from, right? And then they said, is that allowed or is it not allowed and stuff like that? How does it harm people? How does it benefit people? They started evaluating all these things with the rules that Allah SWT has given us, right? And then when they understood the entire picture, for example, before the actual printed money was, they would have like notes that let's say I might have a bunch of gold coins, for example, or whatever the currency was in coins. I would leave it at a certain person's house, or a place or whatever it was, and they're safekeeping it for me because I don't want to lug it around all the way in the markets and stuff, right? So I just let somebody sort of hold it for me, and then I go and I give it, and then they give me a note that says with them is 1,000 coins on my 1,000 coins and stuff, right? So now I go to the market, and then I just tell the person in the market, hey, go to this person, get exactly this much from that person, and you're good to go. But eventually, it eventually translated into actual printed money that had different amounts. Instead of having a note, now you have different notes that account for different amounts that the person can actually pull from a bank, for example, or they can use that money for whatever. So anyways, that was just an example of understanding the entire picture before actually making a decision on it, before actually giving a judgment on it. And that's the same thing you'll see in court systems and so on, right? But likewise for job descriptions, you before you apply in your resume, for example, you want to know what the job description is. What are they calling for? What am I going to be doing and stuff, right? Typical duties and stuff like that. And then also from the employer's perspective, you're going to see who is it that they're employing, for example. Where does this person stand currently, right? What is their learning right now? What is their experience right now? And so on. They'll evaluate according to that. And then same thing with marriages and stuff. If before you get into a marriage, you want to discuss, what's going on with the other person, where they stand, what they want to do, and then you sort of mention your own things and stuff like that, so you guys understand where you guys are at before you decide to commit and work together, right? So you guys, this is part of how analysis works. So you want to know exactly where people are, where they want to go, and then that's how they're able to sort of tag along with each other and say, we'll work together, okay? And then that. So this is again very important for setting baselines and also setting expectations. So with that, just a few things to keep in mind. Make sure you always have an end vision, and if you don't have an end vision, try to set up something. You can't keep on going in life without having a direction, right? You'll be all over the place and stuff, and at the end you're gonna have to say, what did I accomplish in my life, right? Did I actually do something meaningful, right? So have purpose attached to whatever you're doing as well. Okay, and then another thing we talked about is how things can go wrong. We talked a little bit about unpacking certain other examples that we didn't actually explore, but you guys can explore on your own. And then we mentioned how to make sure you have your own current status as well. So you know where you want to go to, but at the same time, you should evaluate where you already are, right? And where you're not. And then you can chart a path that takes you from where you are to where you want to go. So with that, what are some things, this is for your homework, what are some things that you want to do? What are your goals, right? And then also, what is your current status relative to those goals? Have you evaluated any of those things, right? Have you actually sat down and said, here's where I stand, and here's what I want to go to, right? And then therefore, I'm going to be able to navigate it in this sort of like putting in like milestones essentially, right? That was the keyword you used earlier. So milestones and like charting the path accordingly. Being able to like having that current status is very important in being able to actually put down a plan that you can follow through with and actually get to your destination. Because if you're not truthful about, if you're not honest, if you're not detailed about like where you stand right now, you're not going to be able to actually move forward to where you want to get to in a sustainable way. You're going to get overwhelmed. You're going to get confused. You're going to start blaming things. You're going to be like, no, that's not it. You're not going to accept the reality and stuff because you've already like taken like 10 steps and now you're embarrassed to admit that, like I actually should have like been more honest about where I was and so on. These are some things to keep in mind. Okay, so and that's what I want you to do. Explore that. Have you done your analysis for yourself? Have you actually explored and done your research of where you stand relative to a particular goal that you have in mind? And if you did, then this is the time to do that. And inshallah, next time we'll explore about a little bit about how to do that, and then we'll go give some examples and so on, inshallah, so you have some something to connect back to. So with that, if you have any questions, this is the time to go ahead and do that. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording, inshallah, so you guys can ask questions.